Hello, I'm Claire from Eternal Magpie, and I'm here to talk to you about witches, specifically about how to find them, and specifically how to find an early modern witch. Now, I wrote a blog post about this for the history department last week, which went out on Halloween, obviously. I'll put a little link to that in the description below. And the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed that actually I did do this video about how to find an early modern witch last week, put it up, watched it, realised there were a couple, just too many mistakes in it for my liking, so I decided to have another go, basically. So I've got some notes, so if you see me staring over there, it's because I've got some notes written down because I'm really very bad with names and dates, which is a little bit of a problem for a historian, but you know, we look things up. It's fine. So, what I wrote about in this blog post for the history department was how to find an early modern witch. In terms of which sources are now readily available for modern people, such as ourselves, to go and look at. So there are scanned copies of original texts online, there are facsimiles, there are editions, translations, the National Archives have got a huge, great mountain of documentation from the witch trials, and they've also got a really helpful package designed for, I think, for A-level teachers on basically how to work with these types of archives, which is really, really useful, especially for someone who's a beginner at any sort of level, really, at looking at this time period, looking at this type of subject, and working with these types of document. So there are links to a whole bunch of sources in the blog post, and the link for that will be below. You know how YouTube works. While I was writing this blog post, one of the works that I wanted to write about, one of the people I wanted to write about, was Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins. Now, because I'd only been looking at witches sort of incidentally for my masters, I was working on this beastie here, Gerard's Herbal, and witches crop up from time to time. What I hadn't done for my masters, but which I'm going to do for my PhD, is look more deeply into what witches are doing in herbals. Simple as that, really. What are they doing there? What are people worried about? What do people expect that they're going to do? What are some problems with witches? So I thought I'd better get a bit of background going on about the sort of the culture of the time and why people in general were worried about witches before I start looking at the herbals to see why people like Gerard in particular was worried about witches. So, Matthew Hopkins. While I was reading about him, I discovered a few things that I didn't know. So, here they are. The first thing that I didn't know about Matthew Hopkins' Witchfinder General is that he gave that title to himself. He made it up. There was no official Witchfinder General, there was no official witch-finding system, there was no system of inquisition in England. All of the witch trials were run the same way as trials for any other kind of crime, which is through the regular system of assize courts. So if you wanted to be a witch hunter in the 1640s, you just got on with it. You just declared yourself a witchfinder, Witchfinder General, got on with it. Fact number 2 that I didn't know about Matthew Hopkins, along with his partner, John Stern, they were only witch hunters for about 3 years, from 1644 to 1647. In that period, they rounded up about 100 alleged witches. Or rather, 100 alleged witches were executed, having been rounded up by William Hopkins and John Stern. So, witch issues in England sort of started in the early 15th and went on until the late 18th centuries, thereabouts. So that's quite a long time. And in England, only about 500 witches were executed. And 100 of those were found by Matthew Hopkins and John Stern in a 3-year period. Wow, that's a lot of witches in not very much time. So fact number 3 that I didn't know about Matthew Hopkins was that because of this great prolific number of witches that he managed to round up, he was actually accused of witchcraft himself. There was a certain amount of suspicion came about as to how Matthew Hopkins had been so successful. What did he know? How was he finding all these witches? And did he in fact have some kind of special powers that enabled him to find a witch? Was it the case that only a witch could find this many witches? So he was accused of witchcraft himself in 1647. Somewhat conveniently, also in 1647, he retired. He decided he'd, found enough witches, thank you very much. No more Witchfinder General. He retired from witchcraft hunting in 1647. In that year, he also published his very famous book, The Discovery of Witches. So far, so good. Now, what I didn't know about the book, The Discovery of Witches, is that it's really small. I mean, I was sort of familiar with other books about witches. I was familiar with the Malleus Maleficarum. I was recently had a little look at the Demonology by King James the 6th of Scotland and 1st of England. So these sort of fairly chunky treatises on the problems with witches and what witches did and how to recognise them and what the dangers were. So I had assumed that Matthew Hopkins' 1647 book, The Discovery of Witches, was the same, as sort of a chunky little book on how to find witches. In fact, when I started looking at some online library catalogues, I noticed that the dimensions were really small. It's only got 10 printed pages plus an illustration across from the title page. And it's only 20 centimetres tall. So in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I prepared earlier. So that is the total extent of Matthew Hopkins' The Discovery of Witches. 10 pages of text and a big picture. So there you go, it's very small. The other thing I hadn't realised about this book is that it's not so much about the discovery of witches in the sense of how to find one. It's more about Matthew Hopkins defending the means by which he was able to discover witches. It was not uncommon for early modern books to be written in the form of a conversation. And this one is written in the form of an exchange between Matthew Hopkins himself and the public, in the form of questions that are supposed to have been addressed about Hopkins to the assize courts. So there are questions about, you know, have you unduly tortured people in order to gain confessions of witchcraft? And Hopkins justifies his methods. He says that some witches have come to him, apparently on the advice of the devil, at which point it's basically okay to get, because they've already confessed, so you can sort of do what you like after that. But my favourite part is query 4, where the question is basically, how are you finding these witches? What makes you, Matthew Hopkins, uniquely qualified to find these witches? You know, what makes you better than any old guy down the street who could say, oh yeah, I found a witch. What's your experience? And Matthew Hopkins' query 4 is illustrated alongside the title page with this now quite familiar image, in which he explains that in his hometown of Manningtree in Essex, he went to find, he found some witches, and they told him all about their familiars and all about their imps and all about the devil. And by being familiar with those witches, he was then able to take the information that he had learned from these specific witches and apply it to the finding of other witches. Now, one of the most convenient ways that you can recognise a witch is that she will have an imp or a familiar, which again you can see in the illustration. We can see Holt, who is a little white kitten, which, to be fair, if you've met a kitten, they could be considered a demonic entity, you know, perhaps. Sack and Sugar is a small black rabbit. Not, I mean, it's a black animal, but it's not super demonic. News is a polecat or a ferret. They seem, you know, they're pets, really, aren't they? I mean, let's be honest, they're pets. The one that's slightly less of a pet, you can see at the bottom there, that's Vinegar Tom, who is a greyhound with the head of a calf, obviously. And as if that wasn't demonic and witchy enough for you, at some point Vinegar Tom transforms into a child aged about 4, but with no head. And it later just vanishes. So that's your evidence. That's your evidence that in this meeting with witches, in which he was introduced to their familiars and they name their imps with names that no human could possibly ever come up with. On that basis, he was able to find all of these other witches. So if you're interested in early modern witches, and if you're interested in finding out what actually happened, rather than sort of believing in a whole bunch of myths and things that have grown up over the past however many 100 years, you actually can now go online and go to the original sources and read the 10 pages of Matthew Hopkins' The Discovery of Witches from 1647 and find out for yourself what he was up to, which I think, personally, as a historian and just as a, you know, general interested nosy person, I think that's brilliant. So again, the link to the blog is underneath, and in the blog there are links to about half a dozen early modern sources of books about witchcraft. So have a look, go for it, see for yourself. It's brilliant. That's it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.